The banks in Egypt reopened on Monday, and yet attempts to return the country to normality after 2 weeks of anti-government protest suffered a number of setbacks. Protesters prevented the reopening of a major government building, and they continue to occupy Cairo's Tahrir Square. They say they will only leave when President Hosni Mubarak stands down. Sunday's talks between the government and some opposition groups are exposing a split in the opposition, both organised and less organised, as I've been hearing from Nabila Ramdani, a freelance journalist who writes for The Guardian and the Daily News Egypt.
Some of the leaders of the opposition groups have now agreed to engage in talks with the Vice President and Mubarak's regime, and they're working towards setting up a transitional unity cabinet. But of course, because they have very different approaches to what they want to see changing in the country, it will be very hard to get a united view on what they want and hence form a united government, as it were.
So your understanding at the moment is that the people in the square are less likely to go with this more, you might call it a centrist approach.
Yes, I think one of the major developments since the opposition groups have now agreed to engage in talks with the government is that we now have a split between political discussions, effectively, between opposition leaders and the government, who are quite happy to adopt a more pragmatic and see a smooth transition towards democratic change in the future, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we still have masses of demonstrators gathered on Tahrir Square who would like to adopt a more radical approach, which is continue the protests to try and force President Mubarak to step down immediately. And they do not want to wait until potential constitutional amendments are made in March, because that's what the discussions are all about now.
Is it fair for some of the protesters to say, well, with Mr. Suleiman, it's just business as usual? It's the same old group of people still running things.
Absolutely. I think it's very unfair on the protesters who have been demonstrating day in, day out for 2 weeks now, that literally a handful of leaders are now deciding on the future of Egypt with effectively generals who are loyal allies of President Mubarak, the Vice President Omar Suleiman, but also the Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq, who are very close to the President. And now we're seeing a handful of opposition leaders deciding on the future of the country when the vast majority of people are being let down.
What about the economic side of things? Because things are far from normal. Nothing's really returned to normal since the protest began, has it?
Indeed, and that's a further tactic used by the government to call on the protesters to just give up demonstrating and go back to work. Banks and some businesses have now reopened, and it's all to do with giving an impression of normality, that nothing major has happened over the last 2 weeks, and that you can just go back to work and, let us discuss the future of the country with opposition leaders, but please stay out of it. And in fact, the government, in that respect, is buying time to keep Mubarak in place, even though he's more of a figurehead now. But the government is also capitalizing on people being, extremely poor, and they are torn between demonstrating on Tahrir Square or lining up to get some bread or the basic, food commodities. It's a very hard choice to make. And let's not forget that we're talking about a population, half of it lives under the poverty line. So it's a very hard choice to make, to either stick to their guns and try to get what they essentially want immediately, i.e. to see President Mubarak leave, or deal with day-to-day life.
And we also see that the reshuffled cabinet met for the first time on Monday, and their major accomplishment was to raise public sector pay. Cynically, that might seem to be an attempt to buy some allies.
Indeed, and we've seen some of those tactics used in the past when every opportunity or every means to get people to desist from demonstrating has been used by the government, including paying people to organize pro-Mubarak demonstrations. Again, it's the classic divide and rule, and the fact that the government is now trying to buy people to make sure that they're offering them money effectively to desist from demonstrating. And I have to say, it's something that some Egyptians, in fact most Egyptians, would consider, given that most of them live in utter poverty.